hello, everybody. Nice to see you yet again. I will give you a few more moments to start piling in. I think that you're probably out there. And it's the Irish Influence here. And you see my colleague, Michael Cronin. And we're going to be talking this afternoon or this evening, depending on what part of the world that you're in, to Emile Pine, who we're very, very excited about. Mike, would you like to go ahead?
I would.
Thank you.
I'm just thinking the numbers are still tipping up, so we can take our time, go slowly. So no rush, Joe. Yes, I'll do that. I'll do the introduction bit. So anyway, it's a great delight today to have Emile Pine, who is a professor of modern drama at UCD and the author of the #1 bestseller, which I'm sure most people tuning in are familiar with, Notes to Self, which won the 2018 and Post Irish Book of the Year. But as well as that kind of memoir writing, she's also written widely on a host of issues and has been at the forefront of memory studies in Ireland, publishing widely in the fields of theatre and memory studies, including her Politics of Irish Memory, Performing Remembrance in Contemporary Irish Culture, and more recently, the Memory Marketplace, Witnessing Pain in Contemporary Irish and International Theatre. And the good news for us or our friends over in Boston is Emilie is a Burns Scholar in the fall of 2021. So she's heading across the Atlantic. So Emilie, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, I'm thrilled to be chatting with you tonight, to you, Michael and Joseph, and then, but also particularly to be coming to Boston in the fall. It's just, yeah, it's something to look forward to, shall we say, in a time when we all need goals.
Absolutely.
You'll be all vaccinated and mad to travel at that point. You'll lose control. Anyway, to begin. Obviously, one thing, Emilie, you grew up in Dublin and London, and you did your undergraduate and postgraduate work at Trinity before taking your position you hold now in UCD. What was it in all the kind of life turns that you had that made you decide to go down that academic route?
That was the glamour, really. Of academia, no. Well, I mean, it sort of was. I kind of thought it was exciting and glamorous, and it looked like a job without looking like a job. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but really, on a personal level, I had been a kind of crazy kid and had a very checkered school career. But when I got to university and I was doing English in Trinity, I really loved it. I just fell in love with doing the subject, and I felt for the first time that I belonged. And I sometimes say to students now who are thinking about doing a PhD or wanting an academic career, I think, well, if you feel that you belong here, then you do that and you never have to leave, because that's what I did. And on a professional level, though, I also think that it's the kind of work where you get to be within an institution, yet to be your own person completely. So academia really rewards and permits you to follow your own research and your own interests and your own passions, and to teach them as well, right? To have this connection and this energy with students, which is one of my big motivations, but within a kind of safe environment where you get to be within a structure and you get to have colleagues. So I feel like there's something oddly entrepreneurial about being an academic, where you're constantly inventing yourself and inventing what it is that your job description is. But at the same time, you're within a massive tradition and you're within a context, that means you don't have to invent yourself. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting career. And now, oddly, I feel that one of my favorite things about it is we get 2 new years a year. That sense of the rhythm of the academic life. And I think students and academics share it, that there are times when you're teaching and it is busy and there's that rhythm to it. And then there's the long summer holidays, and the time for research and for thinking and for being quiet. And I really like that the way that academia blends all these opposites together.
Wow. I'm not hearing you, Mike. I think that
I was
you just
going to say,
actually silence yourself for a moment.
It's me. It's okay. Technological incompetence. Obviously, one thing you did do, Emily, which, I mean, as we know from all kinds of stories of Dublin and universities and their relationships, you obviously switched from Trinity to UCD. I mean, what was that like as an experience to jump across the city to the concrete of Belfield?
So, I mean, really good. I was never a student in UCD. So, and I've been a lecturer. I joined as a junior lecturer and I'm now a professor at UCD 12 years ago. And not having ever studied there made me feel like I could come in and kind of do the job and pretend to be authoritative before I felt that I actually had any authority. And whereas I think at Trinity, I really identified with that as a space of earlier development. And it's a wonderful institution, and I still have lots of friends there, and they have a great library, and a very convenient campus for inner city picnics. But the UCD, it's just much bigger as well. You know, it's just on a larger scale, and you just get a range of students who you don't get in Trinity, because in Trinity, you know, if you're teaching an English class, you have 40 students, and in UCD you have 400, and that can be a little bit intimidating. And I remember my first, and if there are any early academics here listening, I can tell you that I can remember my first lecture in UCD and practicing it the night before. And it was in this, it was to 500 students, and the security guard like letting me into the theatre and saying yes, no, okay, go ahead. And he was my audience for my lecture on, I think, Ibsen and A Doll's House or something, and realizing that it was this really steep lecture theatre, and you couldn't wear heels, because if I wore heels, there was no way I would be able to get down the steps because they were so steep. And realizing that, okay, fine, I'm really glad that I practiced. So there's a really strange way in which the scale of UCD challenges you to raise your game in a different way, and to be a different kind of teacher, and to think about, to think about a broader range of students' needs, which I find actually more interesting.
And obviously, I mean, one thing, I mean, the time you were at Trinity, I mean, you are of that generation that kind of emerged into the Celtic Tiger years, and, you know, the massive fundamental changes that happened within Ireland and to Ireland. I mean, how was that like? I mean, obviously, we'll get to know yourself later, but obviously, in terms of an awareness of your parents' life, their upbringing, their experience of that island, what was it like for you to kind of reflect? Did you even reflect on the idea that you were into something new, shiny, and differently minted to the generation that went before?
Yeah, I think so. And I think what the kind of watershed moment for that was that the year I started university was 1995. And that autumn was the year that Ireland had a referendum on divorce, which I campaigned in, and where it passed very, very narrowly. And so divorce became legal then in January 1997. And for anybody who doesn't know, who hasn't read my book, my parents separated when I was 6. And so that was a huge personal deal for me, but it did have that sense, Mike, of which I think subsequent referenda have also created, with the referendum on abortion and then the referendum on equal marriage, and this sense of deliberately and consciously creating a kind of Ireland that we wanted to live in, an Ireland that was about compassion and understanding and respect. Whereas only a few years earlier, when I was still living in Dublin in 1991, and when I was, a very young teenager, having really intense conversations with all my friends about how soon we could emigrate. Because in 1991, myself and my female friends in particular could not have imagined living in Ireland. It did not look like a country where, you're talking about the same years as the X case, and you're talking about, it being illegal to buy condoms. And even to say the word condom out loud could cause a scandal. And which, of course, because I was 14, I did as much as possible. But that sense of Ireland being deeply inhospitable, and that feels radically different now. And it was one of the things that a lot of us said when we were campaigning in the last two referendums, and in particular when I was knocking on doors for the abortion referendum, and saying to older people, well, you know, do you remember the divorce referendum? It's 25 years ago, and there are more people married today post-divorce referendum than were married beforehand. So it has not meant the end of the Irish society, that the values that you cherish, and thinking about how those moments then pave the way for future progression and equality.
Thanks, Emily. These are really wonderful insights into that particular moment and that great shift that was taking place in Ireland at that time. And indeed, in your own life, that somehow perhaps mirrored that great shift, that great alteration that took place. And before I continue with the question, I just want to speak to everybody out there and say that you're extremely welcome, please, actually, to ask any questions that you want. You see two little buttons down there on your laptop or your computer or whatever else it might be. And there is one that says Q&A, and that's for your questions and answers. And the other one is for chat. You can write any of them, whatever pleases you. And any of those questions, I'll be keeping an eye on them as we go along. And I'll be putting them to Mike and putting them to Emily, please. First of all, thank you very, very much, Ash, for saying such wonderful things about the life of the academic. I hope it's as gorgeous. It's clear that you have fitted in terribly well. And I just want to ask a little bit about actually that fitting in. Was it as easy as you sound? And I'm thinking that within our audience, I bet there are quite a number of young women, especially actually, who are coming up into this business. And maybe they find some difficulty. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that transition was for you?
To becoming a lecturer, you mean?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, you would have had to be very, very unobservant not to notice when I passed my PhD in 2005, not to notice that most of the professors were male. And to think about, okay, well, how does that change? And I think one of the big things for me was having female mentors.
Right.
And male ones too, I would say. You know, my current head of school, John Brannigan, has been one of the greatest mentors to me. But particularly female figures who I could see had done it and who were still sane. And I think of my colleagues, Margaret Callagher, who is a previous Burns scholar, and Geraldine Meany, and kind of other, and those are just to name two, and I'm probably forgetting lots of really important people, but I you know that phrase, you know, you can't be it until you can see it. And right. I think that's really, really important. And I think then there was a lot of crack as well in those conversations, you know, to kind of laugh about some of the difficulties and the challenges at the same time and creating a community at the same time as saying, okay, right, here's a promotion opportunity. Or I've had amazing people kind of send me job ads and say, here is a position you could apply for. I worked for a few years in the UK, and I wanted to come back to Ireland, but at that point there weren't any jobs. And that was exactly what happened, was people saying to me, do you know that there's a job at UCD? And, you know, without that kind of support, I think it can feel quite isolating, whatever your gender. I mean, I do think as well that in the current situation of precarity in universities, where you're talking about 10-month contracts, you're looking at people who are on, you know, the 7th year of their postdoc, and the kind of paucity of secure, full-time, properly paid academic jobs. It's no longer about gender. It's actually about thinking about equality of access due to the market. And senior scholars having to advocate in a slightly different way now, I think.
So it's no longer, and indeed, and you have achieved great success as a writer and as an academic. But you have written that even now that you discovered that you had internalized the idea that in order to be taken seriously as an intellectual, that you had to deny your own feelings of femininity.
Well, that training dies hard, right? These habits are ingrained in us. And I think, men are socialized in ways to have this kind of masculine demeanor that does them no favors either. And women are socialized in other ways. And then if you notice, for example, as I said, in 2005, that all of these blokes basically are in all the top jobs, and they're all in the pub drinking, and they're all backslapping, and there's a kind of performance of and I'm aware that I'm talking to two really nice men and that these generalizations are just not true of everybody, right? But in very simple brushstrokes, there is a kind of there was at least a performance of kind of masculine identity to do with being uber professional and rhetorically powerful and all the rest, that it felt difficult in some cases to fit into, to use your term. And so, I might have molded myself in very particular ways and believed that feelings did not belong at work. And they, if you had them at work, you had them behind a door, whether that was your office door or a toilet door. Because, you were upset about a meeting, or work was overwhelming, or, you said yes to one too many projects and you're lying on the floor of your office thinking, I can't cope with this. And it has been, a big transition for me, and for me it was in writing an autobiographical work, Notes to Self, and revealing these kind of things that I was terrified of other people finding out, that I was a person with feelings, and everybody saying to me too.
So writing was the trick for you. That was the
absolutely
that allowed you to become the person who you are. That's really marvelous, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, just to slip back into another important part, like when we move to Notes to Self, is obviously you are one of the sort of, not the only, but one of the kind of key people in the sort of drive to create and kind of understand the Irish past through memory studies. I mean, what drew you to that field?
I could create a fiction here, which is a largely retrospective one, where I said, I was really interested in memory studies and it's an emergent field. In hindsight, it looks quite clear. What it was for me was that I was really interested in a whole range of different subjects and different forms. So I was fascinated by the films and television, for example, made about the hunger strikes in Northern Irish prisons. I was really interested in plays about Magdalene laundries and families and, the Troubles and all of these, that famous Heaney phrase, whatever you say nothing. All of this culture about how the truth about who you are, but particularly where you have come from, has to be silent and repressed. And I had grown up, and I've alluded to it a tiny bit with having kind of a personal history of parents who were separated in a highly Catholic country where people just didn't do that. Really aware of the impact and consequences of those silences. And so I think it was the idea of breaking silence that first drew me to the work in that field. And then it was kind of a case that I was interested in all of these disparate things, but if you want to have a career and if you want to publish a book, you have to actually have a field. You have to have something that unifies them. And I went through a process of taking a step back and realizing I was going to film conferences, I was going to theatre conferences, I was going to Irish literature conferences. I didn't really feel that I belonged. And then I thought, it's the umbrella of memory. And I think that that's a really important step for any academic in their career development, is to consider what is the unifying theme, what is your intellectual signature. And like I said, I can see that much more clearly in hindsight than I could at the time, but I thought, okay, memory studies. And one of the things, I mean, you know, I'm also talking to a historian, so the other side of the aisle, but what I liked about memory studies was that sense of ambiguity, that it embraces the uncertainty principle, and it says that there are many ways of knowing the past, and that multiplicity, I think, is really, really helpful when you're particularly when you're looking at contested pasts, because it says we're not trying to come up with the version. We're interested in exploring how many versions there actually are, and the storytelling aspect of memory is fascinating. And it's an emergent field, right? Because the memory studies, the International Memory Studies Association, is only a few years old, and it went from, you know, a kind of the first workshop having 25 people at it to within a year having over 1,000 people at its first major conference. So it's a really burgeoning field, and I think Ireland is in many ways very, very well placed to take advantage of that field, and to use that field to understand its culture and its history better.
And within that context, Emilie, obviously you were the lead researcher on the industrial memories kind of rereading of the report of the Commission of Inquiries into Child Abuse. But in the context of your own work within memory studies, how did you react this week to the report of the Committee of Investigation into the Mother and Baby Homes that's clearly dominated the news, the airwaves and discussion this week?
So reports are really important because they are the official state narrative of a series of events in the past. A lot of really important research has obviously been done this authority, and because of the resources behind the report and the amount of time to develop it, it encompasses so much. It has a really wide-ranging authority as well. Now, I have only read the executive summary. The report itself is 3,000 words. I mean, one of the issues with reports is that they are so big, so they take a really long time to have a nuanced appreciation of. And I, you know, absolutely want to be respectful of the amount of work that I know went in to the report by the three authors. I have done a lot of work with survivors, both in terms of the kind of the Ryan report, which is about child abuse, but also broadening that out to do an oral history project, where with the National Folklore Collection, which is housed at UCD, we've done a really long-term and ongoing project where we record the stories of survivors. And there are protocols and ethics to asking people to tell you their story. And the first protocol is that you believe them and you allow them, and this is, I think, is crucial, you allow them to be the experts of their own story, their own history, and their own experience. And the risk, and this is a risk I have taken so many times and failed at, and I think this is a big risk for academics getting involved in this discussion, is that we act like we are the experts. And that's not the case. Actually, the person who went through it, and I believe this really, really forcefully, needs to be accorded the respect of being seen as the expert and not as the subject of study, and to not have their voices appropriated. And I'm horrified by the assertion that the report contains that there is no evidence that the church and state were involved in forcing women into mother and baby homes, and that there is no evidence of forced adoption. First of all, they didn't have the scope to investigate two of the largest adoption agencies, so that claim in itself is hugely circumscribed. The second is that there is a lot of evidence, and it's in the report, in the testimony of the people who gave their stories. And it costs survivors something to tell their stories. It is a huge ask when we say to them, can you please share your stories and your experience with us? And I find it extraordinary that process is so, the mistake that is so often made is that their stories are then taken from these people, and they are disempowered by the process, and it's very, very upsetting. And there are ways around it. There are ways. There is an ethics around doing this, and unfortunately have been fielding calls this week from people whose names were wrong in the report, and small tiny errors like that you might put down to a typo, but unfortunately when you don't have a birth certificate, that typo matters. So the stakes are incredibly high, and like I said, I really want to be respectful of the amount of work that went in on behalf of the authors' reports, but I would definitely have come to different conclusions myself.
I just want to continue actually with your own expertise here on the question of memory and remembering, and what we can remember and what we don't remember, and what we wish to and what we're unable perhaps to remember. And I'm thinking about something in the newspapers and on the radio programs, which have been hugely moving over the course of the week. The question of blame, who's accountable, has come up time and again. Families, clergy, politicians, arms, who is responsible? And what strikes me, of course, is that it took a report like this about the system of abuse, in which vast numbers of people have been implicit. It took somebody like Catherine Corless, apparently, to remind us of what we had already known. I mean, how can this be? I mean, is this social forgetting? Is this what another world scholar, Guy Biner, calls disremembering? How does this happen?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to come up with a pithy explanation, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I think that to deal with the first part of the question about a question of blame, it would be very nice if there were a single group in society or institution that we could ascribe blame to. It is clearly a network of responsibility. And it is also then, as a result, a network of knowledge and awareness. And the way that, and I think of it sometimes as a kind of subterranean awareness. And it's strange because what it also makes me wonder is, what will we look back on in 10 or 20 years and say, and our children will say to us, well, I don't have children, but children will say to us, how could you ignore that? I mean, I'm living in Ireland today, and we have however many direct provision centres where asylum seekers are living in massively overcrowded and, situations which totally violate their human rights, where they are getting COVID-19 at much higher levels than the rest of the population. And we're debating, how could society have looked away from the mother and baby homes? We're always looking away from something.
Your term subterranean awareness is a very moving one, a very powerful one there.
Yeah, and so I think it does behove us to ask those questions of ourselves, and as a result, then not really sit in judgment. Sometimes it feels too big in terms of a subject. I'm really struck by, and I know the Ryan report far better than I know the other reports. I'm really struck by, there was a story told by one of the witnesses to the Ryan Commission, which was between 2000 and 2009. And he said that he was sent to the local shop to buy more canes because the priests, obviously used them for corporal punishment. And the shopkeeper broke all of the canes and said, go back and tell them that I didn't have any. And that actually gives me chills. Those tiny actions tell you about that subterranean awareness, and about the tiny actions of compassion that people are capable of making and the difference they're capable of making. And I mean, I talked to one woman, and she's in her 60s now, late 60s now, and she remembers being given a sweet once a week by a nurse who came to the school on weekends. And when she was a child. So you're talking about 60 years later, she remembers tiny moments like that. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which small actions actually can make a difference, just as we shouldn't either allow ourselves to forget in the current moment what big institutional things are. I mean, I also think we place a lot of trust in governments to act on our behalf, whether we're talking about institutions, we're talking about climate crisis, we're talking about how our past is preserved and protected.
And perhaps we put a lot of trust in government, but I think we were always skeptical of government in this country. We did, however, put a huge amount of trust in the churches.
Yes.
And I think, I don't know, Mike, do you want to take from there?
No, I mean, one thing I think just leading on from that, I mean, there is that sense, I mean, even in the years I've been living here, but I mean, sort of going back into the 90s and the 80s, with these big reports, we've been there before. Mm. You walk around any town, any city, pretty much anybody who's lived there their life can tell you what went on, not what went on, but what those buildings were, what they symbolized, why they had high walls. But there is this whole culture of the, I don't want to say Irish population kind of willingly knowing, but definitely knowing. And I think what I'm intrigued in by your idea of the way the people who went through these experiences have to be believed first off, and that's non-negotiable. And yet we just seem to be going through these reports that constantly, again, not criticizing the researchers, but in the way they're presented, perhaps, the tone of them, the fact they're channeled through government, the fact that, it's the church, but they're over there somewhere. The fact that we're just going through this time and time again, we just keep repeating this. And it's almost as if, as a state, this country, and this is a diaspora problem, obviously adoption has gone global, it's just the same news every time. I mean, there's something fundamentally depressing about that there's given, I mean, you and I have worked on this before in the seminars and stuff, the whole idea of justice and how it's applied around the world and how people have thought of new models and new conversations. The Irish just seem to say, well, commission, job done, tick, move on.
I mean, I don't think it's our problem alone, Mike. We just happen to live in this country and know it better than others. Mm. I mean, I think that, you're looking at other states. I mean, Canada has had exactly the same issue with their reports and their commissions. There are signs of hope in the sense that when the Ryan report was launched in 2009, survivors were not allowed to come to the launch. It was only for the media, and so they were in a room outside the launch. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary. Whereas on this occasion, survivors were given the report a day in advance. I mean, a day isn't enough, but they were given a day in advance. I think that the former Minister for Children, Catherine Zappone, set up a forum for survivors to have a voice and to think about issues of transitional justice and reconciliation. And so that there was some sense of stakeholders' involvement. And that's really crucial. I think to come back to the church and what you said at the end, Joe, there is like, it's the failure of responsibility from the church is extraordinary, and the consistency with which the church is allowed to get off the hook time and time again, whether you're talking about financially in terms of redress. So they have held on to the money that was meant to go to survivors in extraordinary situations where survivors are literally dying, they're literally in hospital, and are asking for their funerals to be paid for. That's the extent to which the church has withheld compensation. And or to the extent that they refuse to apologize fully. They refuse to, and as you and I both know, Mike, they refuse to actually release their records. They have a lot of records that we're not seeing, that they have concealed or destroyed. And they're doing that worldwide. This is not only restricted to Ireland. And no one has gone to jail. Not a single person. And this is a real problem. It's interesting to me. I mean, if you expand it out to other kinds of truth commissions, and again, very broad brushstrokes here, I'm struck by the fact that in Argentina, for example, they never had a truth commission. Instead, they had court cases. They had an amnesty, and then they overturned that amnesty with a case to the Argentinian Supreme Court. And instead, people have gone to jail. And there is a choice between the kinds of truths that commissions can make possible and which are important in terms of acknowledgement and healing, but that actually nobody is punished.
But one of the big questions, I'm going to try and lead into notes to self here, but pick up on a comment you talked about earlier of going to UCD back in the day when the faculty were mainly men who went up to the bar and put the world right in their own image. Going back into the church, a male church, isn't actually one of the big problems here, patriarchy, historically, presently, and that, how can we dance around the specifics of the issue that's going to get thrown up? That is a huge problem in Irish society, ongoing. It's ongoing in the professions, it's ongoing in the universities, in the church, in government, etc., ad nauseum.
Yes, it is. And the patriarchy is why there's Trump. I mean, it is poison. And it is consistently problematic and really, really virulent, to use a virus metaphor, and really, really difficult to get rid of as a result. And if we could go into lockdown on the patriarchy, that would be great. And sorry, I'm kind of joking about it because I have lots of serious answers. We would be here for a really long time. It is very obviously the problem.
Please.
And it requires everyone to be at the table in order to fix it. And this is the problem with any kind of negotiation, which is that if we want equality, then some people have to give up power so that others can have it. Sharing is not possible with everybody sitting at the same table and not wanting to give up their chairs. And then it becomes rhetorical, and you hear phrases like, we would really like to. And I mean, just even to bring it back to the university, in UCD, they brought in a quota system for a certain level of committees, so that committees had to have 40% have women representatives on them. And then they had to bring in another rule that said that women could only sit on a certain number of committees because there were so few women that they were sitting on all of the bloody committees, and they were massively overworked as a result, which is part of the problem of changing the system, is who's going to do the work. And women and other minorities end up being the workhorses time and time again. So that is why I do the jokey version at the beginning, because I would really like men to fix some of this problem.
I know that along with Mike, we'd all very much like to turn to your own writing and notes to self. But there are a number of questions coming in, and they're all terribly welcome, actually. So continue, please, to pull up your questions here, because we've still got plenty of time, and we'll address as many of them as we possibly can. And first of all, thanks very much. Nice to see you out there, Tim McMahon, for your kind comments, and also Jim Dalsmer. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. We're going to come to your question in a few moments, actually, and David Gillette. But one on the topic we're on, I hear from Marcus Breen, and Marcus says that the implications of the Mother and Baby Homes report this week. He says, he wonders, how do you see the emergence of secularism in Ireland as the dominant role of the Catholic Church fades? And secondly, he wonders, could you imagine Ireland ever returning to a culture more influenced by its ancient traditions of law and culture? So he's asking you to look back and to look forward a little bit there.
That's a very interesting, the second half is very, very interesting. And the first is that I think a lot of people are still Catholics, even if the church has been, whatever it has been, undermined. It's had its authority massively undermined. And I think we need to make a distinction between the institution and the faith. And the religion, and I'm not an expert on either, but I think at our peril we talk about people's faith as if it were the institution, because that is a very private and deeply personal thing. But I welcome that. I welcome secularism in terms of state institutions. I find it extraordinary that 92% of primary school education is still in effect run by the Catholic Church in Ireland. And I think the influence of that has lessened massively. But, my nephew goes to school in a room with a Virgin Mary at the top, and is consistently told that God made the world. And whereas when he comes home, he gets a very rational, scientific view of how the world was made. And he's like, but my teacher said. And so I think there still is very much a conflict between the ways in which religion basically is still a very much a too strong or too prevalent part of Irish institutions. The second part about ancient laws and traditions, it sounds like the person asking the question might know more about them than I do. I had friends when I was in my 20s who wanted to bring back, this is before divorce was permissible, and wanted to bring back Brehon law and marriage under Brehon law, because that was, you could dissolve those through an agreement and a shake of the hands, as opposed to the kind of the much more corporate institution of marriage as we have it instituted by the state. I think one of the advantages of living in a small country is it's hard to forget your values. And I do really think that Ireland has revived its values, actually, in terms of the values I think are important about compassion and recognizing other people's rights to be themselves. And I think that is a way of getting out of the really destructive, toxic authority of the Catholic Church that said there is one way to live and one way only. And I think that what we have seen in the last two referendums, and I think particularly of the abortion referendum, is that a lot of people voted for the sake of others, not for themselves. And I find that very inspiring.
I just love that suggestion of reviving her values. Suggestion that there were values there that somehow or other were temporarily quashed or squashed or laid aside, that we can return to. That's very nice thought. Yes.
Let's move on to notes to self. And I'm sure a lot of people, when they hear your name, think of notes to self, not necessarily as scholarly work. Some people know both. But why did you decide with Note to Self to write that story, your own story? What was something that you felt you had to put out into the world?
So I started it not wanting to put it out in the world at all. It was really the first essay that I wrote is the first essay in the collection, which is about my father, who was an alcoholic all my life, and who in 2013 went into liver failure and nearly died. And the happy ending, which is also a plot spoiler for anyone who hasn't read it, is that he survived and is still, he lives in Greece, he's still there and very much sober and around, which is great news. But it was a really, really intense period. I'd spent most of my life imagining it happening. And then when it happens, you realize that you can't really imagine what it's like to be in intensive care with a parent. And so even after he stabilized, I realized I needed to do something with this. And I think, Mike, you'd asked me previously if I'd found it cathartic to write it. And that was my initial motivation, really, was to get it out of my head and to stop having to feel the emotions this is me, I don't have emotions, remember, and to stop having to have the emotions every minute of my life. I just didn't want to. And writing, again, I mean, you know, not everyone is mad enough as I am to publish their memoir. I mean, I highly recommend it, but at the same time, it's nerve-wracking. The process of writing as a form of understanding and owning your own story is a really, really powerful one, and I really, really believe in it. And to do it privately as well as publicly. But then there was that I had written this essay about my dad, and I didn't even really know what it was. And my partner read it, and he said, "This is really good," which he doesn't say about my academic work. He would deny that, but good in a different way is what I think he meant. Readable in a different way. And so I sent it to a really small independent feminist Irish publisher called Tramp Press, who only published fiction. And the reason I sent it to a fiction publisher was because I thought they would give me an honest opinion. And I said, is this any good as a piece of writing? I really need to know. And they reluctantly said that they would get back to me, and then in the end commissioned me to write the book. I never really, I know it sounds bizarre to say that, I sometimes describe it as an accidental book because I didn't intend, it wasn't part of my 5-year plan. I certainly didn't think it would get me promoted, quite the opposite. And yet it has, right? And which I think vindicates this idea that if you do the thing that is most authentic to you, and you do it you try your hardest at it, then actually that is the thing that will bring you where you want to go. Which is a slightly saccharine view of things, because sometimes it doesn't bring you where you want to go. But anyway, I still think it's worth doing. It was really, I mean, a project that I did with them when they published it. I just wanted it to sell enough copies to not really be embarrassing for everybody concerned. I assumed they had made a huge mistake. I think publishing, it was published a couple of months after the abortion referendum. I think publishing a no holds barred memoir by a 40-year-old Irish woman who had lived through a lot of that Ireland that we're talking about now was actually a very astute move from them as a publisher. They knew it would have an audience. What's been extraordinary to me is the extent to which it's traveled. So there's a US and Canadian edition, there are 15 other language editions. And I thought that, maybe some of these issues were for Irish women only, and it turns out not the case at all. And so there was a book really about all the things. I couldn't come up with a title for a really long time, and my working title was something like "Things You Only Admit to Yourself at 4 o'clock in the morning in the dark," which isn't that catchy, but conveys that sense of deliberately and quite angrily writing the story that I thought I wasn't meant to tell, both as an academic and as an Irish person.
And you might just began that question actually wondering if this was something that you imagined as being cathartic. But you do say at one stage here actually that this complicated and at the same time simple story is a story which you may never stop telling. So once one starts writing, then one continues, that there isn't a conclusion. It's the process rather than the end. Or is that how you feel about it?
I do. I think at some point you have to shut up about yourself, or people stop.
Don't shut up too soon, because your writing is. I mean, it's a most astonishing book, and anybody who hasn't yet read it out there, indeed, I can't recommend too much. Just how, as many people have written there, that as soon as you read that very first story, that tale about your father in Greece and you having to deal with that and look back into your childhood and to look at him, indeed, that they're going to become so engrossed in it, it will lead you right through to the end. And indeed, I see Elizabeth Redwine out there actually saying not just how she enjoyed it, she said she read it in a rush and she loved it. given to her by her mentor, Geraldine Higgins, who some of us know, and she actually thanks you for writing it. And then she goes on to ask a question actually about academics and women academics and how they can gain power in our university and fields without buying into a destructive but praised pace. And that's a kind of a question that we've turned to. Is there anything more you'd like to say to that?
You know, again, I mean, I don't have I saw that question and I don't have a great answer for it, which is that I think we have to lower our expectations of ourselves. I think it is morally bankrupt the way that achievement is now held up as a goal in and of itself, as opposed to what we are gaining in other ways along the way. I look at what I have done and the work that I have done, and I look at the colleagues whose work I know, and I see people around me who are choosing to do things that they are passionate about and they really believe in. Unfortunately, I think that also often comes with a level of overwork, which is punishing. And the problem is that in this precarious university situation, we feel that A, success is a very scarce resource, and B, that too many people are in competition for it. And, you know, it's very easy for me, now I'm a professor, to say we should all slow down and we should stop, because I no longer feel that I'm competing. So I think that instead that we need people who are in leadership positions and who are insecure and relatively senior places in their career to start advocating for more junior colleagues. And for both for spaces for them and for their rights in terms of their right to a secure employment, but also in terms of advocating and recognizing the amount of work that gets done for example, in pastoral care. It's extraordinary to me that it's really, I mean, certainly in the Irish university system, it's often funding applications, external funding, that gets you, a shiny gold star. But the person in the office next to you could be providing 15 hours of feedback to students and getting, no gold stars whatsoever. So I think really revising how we assess the kinds of work that people are doing and recognizing the merit in what's often thankless and often work that goes to women in terms of the pastoral care and so on. And that's not to say there aren't wonderful men who are doing that work too, but that in the main it often goes to women. And to think about to get back to that question about values, what kind of values do we want to be in performance, not just rhetorically, but in reality, in our universities? And we need actually to take our universities back.
And in case this question seems a little bit too incestuous among us academics, actually, that many of these questions are ones that people, I think, in this time of COVID actually are forced to, or perhaps even maybe are permitted to rethink their goals and their values and the way that they go forward and what actually is important to them. So thanks for all of those things. Mike, I see a number of questions here, but do you want one, Mike, while I just go through a few of them?
Obviously one thing that was clear when Notes to Self came out was the reviews were fantastic. But I found it a fascinating book in terms of, it's one of those things that I've met people or people have posted things online that I know, which is their sheer enthusiasm for it. The fact that most people seem to read it. It's a kind of one sitting book that, as Joe said, you're hooked, you're in, and you can't put it down.
I think people should take a break, by the way. I just want to butt in there and say, I'm very worried for people who read it the whole way through, because it's tough. So I can't read it. Yeah, sorry.
No, but it's clearly, it's a personal memoir. It's touched people's personally. They've responded to it. What kind of feedback have you had from people if you've gone about your business or in the old days when there were events and readings and things? Have you had a personal feedback from people, from your readers?
Yeah, a lot, really a lot. I've had people who have given the book to family members with alcohol problems or other addiction issues, as a way of, and then they have a conversation about Emilie's family, but really they're having a conversation about their own family. So it has become a kind of coded way for some people I know, who I didn't know before, but who have got in contact with me. And I started working with an organization that supports the children of alcoholics, actually, as an outcome of having published notes. The chapter that the essay that I get most direct feedback from is the one where called The Baby Years, in which I kind of catalogue the years that myself and my partner spent trying to become parents and have children, and our inability to do so, and the really, really difficult acceptance of wanting something so much and not being able to have it. And then and where I really wanted to get to with that essay, and in my life, because the writing and the living kind of coincided on that one, was to say, to have a life without kids is also a really rich and wonderful life. And I've had so much feedback from women who have had huge numbers of losses of children in terms of miscarriage or stillbirth, or just not being able to conceive at all. Partners who have said, my wife has gone through this and I haven't been able to find the language to talk about it with her, and your book was about us. I mean, the thing that I get most often, which was alarming at first, but I get it now, is people saying, this is my story too. And I kind of thought, it can't be on a literal level. And then maybe my memory scholar brain kicked in and said, you know what, it doesn't have to be literally the same or the same truth as to have an emotional resonance. Oddly, I always think the final chapter, which is about overwork and me hitting burnout, is the one that people are shyest about talking about. And it's the one that I had a few friends, very, very kind friends, read before publishing, and they all said, it might be a little bit of career suicide there, Emilie. And that's the one that people kind of whisper about most. They kind of say, yes, they proclaim quite loudly about the alcoholics in their family, and then lower their voice and say, I'm burnt out as well. And I think it just shows how taboos attach to things that you don't think they will attach to, and how much stigma there is about admitting that you feel overwhelmed at work these days, because work is now increasingly how we define ourselves.
And questions coming in here, Emilie. And first, I'm just David Gillette from Cambridge here, and he wonders indeed if you're familiar with Joseph Valenti's The Myth of Manliness in Irish National Culture, a wonderful work actually of memorialising the same Joseph Valenti, who along with Margot Bacchus has only this week published a really powerful work on child sex abuse in Ireland, indeed. And he also, a little bit later, points out that we now in the United States have an entire museum dedicated to remembering the history of lynching men, women, and even children of colour. Absolutely, and indeed a magnificent museum it is too. A note from Michael Collier, and going back actually to this question of the church, and he says that using the rather vague phrase like the church, he says, is avoiding getting to the heart of the problem. Shouldn't we at least say the hierarchy, or those in power, or better still, name names of those who make the decisions and have made those decisions about these homes along the way? Indeed, a really powerful question. Thanks very much, Michael. I have a question here actually from our own Guy Biner, indeed, the just past Burn Scholar, congratulating you, of course, on your book, The Memory Marketplace, which we haven't really spent a lot of time about. And he wonders if you could tell us a bit about witnessing and docu-verbatim memory theatre and the role it's playing in mediating trauma. Is that something in a few moments that you can actually give us as we're coming to a time?
Thank you, Guy, for the question about my new book. Yes. The current book, The Memory Marketplace, is really about, I mean, so many of the things we've already raised in terms of voices and empowerment. And one of the reasons why I love theatre is because it is literally a stage for some people to speak and other people to listen. And one of the things that really emerged for me in writing the book is to consider how witnessing is a process of exchange. And so often we talk a lot about the witness, imagining that that is the person who is telling us about the event that they have been through or that they have seen. And we don't think as much, I think, about the secondary form of witnessing, which is the act of listening, whereby we as an audience mediate and then remediate when we tell the story again of the experience. And so to think of witnessing as a really dynamic process, and theatre is a wonderful space for doing that, both in terms of literally talking about theatre shows, but then in terms, I think, of a broader understanding of social witnessing, whereby there needs to be an audience who is who attends and who gives their attention to the person who is witnessing, which brings us, back to that issue of survivors speaking, and that we should be listening to survivors rather than, well, to academics. But really thinking about witnessing as a dynamic process, as opposed to a single moment or a kind of a static text. And really, one of the reasons I wanted to write that book was I wanted to write about so many incredible plays that have, and Guy's reference to verbatim theatre, plays that have taken real life events or real life testimony and have turned them into a theatrical spectacle as a way of engaging an audience.
And, we're coming towards the end of our time here, Emilie, but I've got two particular questions that I'd like to put to you. One relating to yourself and to your own family's relationship, and another one actually with another lady, indeed, who's inquiring, coming out of her own background. And the first question actually is, someone who's curious, Martin, would be curious to know how your own family reacted, especially to those parts of the story dealing with what might have been considered family secrets. Any?
Well, Martin, good question, because my mother was not that thrilled, it has to be said, at the start of the process. To be fair to her, she is from a generation where if something bad happens, you close ranks around the secret and around the person who is hurting. You certainly do not, air your dirty laundry in public. Which is exactly what I did. And she said that she could see why I would write the book, but not why I would publish it. And I think actually in the end that she was just very afraid for me. She said to me, I've heard of these people called trolls, and I'm worried, about the impact on you. I was really lucky in terms of its wider reception. In terms of my family, there are two ways, I think, of publishing a memoir. One is to publish and be damned, and one is to do it as a more negotiated process. And my family read the book in draft form almost a year before it was published. They read the first working draft of it. And that was really important to me, partly because memory isn't always accurate. So there were some things that were corrected, but partly also to just give them a sense of being stakeholders in it. And people always ask, and I am completely honest about it. There were a couple of things that in particular my parents were upset by, and I took out. And I think that is, I decided my theory on it was that I could be completely honest about everything in my life, but to reveal their lives, I didn't have the right to do that in every case. And so they never asked me to do it, because actually if they had, I probably wouldn't have. No. But I knew they were deeply unhappy, and I didn't want to, a friend of mine, Paige Reynolds, said, go big or go home. We were having this conversation. I said, well, Paige, I really want to go home sometimes. So for me, it was a negotiation.
Thanks very much, actually. And talking about Paige, of course, is a friend of all of ours, and I get a lovely comment, actually, and congratulations from the wonderful another Emily Bloom, and Guy Biner coming back again to tell us about social witnessing and what a brilliant concept it is. And thank you very, very much for that. We have another question from Alison out there, actually, about her own trauma. And Alison, actually, thank you very much. And she says, in fact, that there are memories she could share about her grandfather's experience in the Irish Civil War, attempted abuse by a government official, etc., and some really harrowing stuff there. And Alison, actually, what I might do indeed is maybe I'll pass that information on to Emily, indeed, because you're wondering there actually where you can share those memories. And there must be many people actually wondering those questions. So feel free, please, actually, to send an email to us, and we'll pass that on and see where we can go from there. Mike.
It's 10:30, Joe.
It is indeed.
It's that time. It's time to go home. Emily, thank you very much. That's absolutely fantastic, fascinating, great conversation. It's just really about next week. Next week, we're starting a kind of mini 4-week series within the Irish Influence. Our friend Christian DuPont from the Burns Library will be joining us next week to explain how and why we've ended up with a series of speakers who are going to be discussing the 4 Nobel laureates, the 4 men who won their Nobel Prizes in literature from Ireland. So the first speaker is going to be Fintan O'Toole, who's going to be discussing with us on the Irish Influence next week the work, the life, the writings of George Bernard Shaw. And Fintan's always great value, got lots of things to say. Obviously, he has mounted an exhibition on Shaw in recent years, written about Shaw. So Fintan and George Bernard next week. But for now, Emily, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been so wonderful to have this conversation, and I think we could have gone on for much longer. So many thanks for listening to me rambling a bit. It was wonderful.
You didn't ramble for a moment, Emily. It was absolutely marvelous. So thank you. Thanks, Mike. Thanks to Claire and Peter who helped us in setting this up. And thanks to everybody who came and who was here actually today. Your comments and your questions were absolutely marvelous and it was really a delight. And I can't wait, as I'm sure you can't wait actually, for Fintan O'Toole, the loquacious, but the always absolutely brilliant Fintan O'Toole, telling us about George Bernard Shaw. He says the first great man in Ireland actually to, in the word in fact, to GBH. What was that? A logo for himself, actually, to invent himself for the mass market. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.